everyone, and welcome to the Ratio Christi South Africa YouTube channel. For those of you who are unfamiliar with what we do, Ratio Christi is a university campus apologetics ministry that equips students and faculty with good historical, scientific, and philosophical arguments for the truth of Christianity. Now, on this YouTube channel, we invite leading scholars from various disciplines around the world to come and present evidence and arguments to defend the truth of Christianity. So last week, we had the privilege of having Stephen Pullman on the show to talk about the reason for everything. And this week, we will be talking to Dr. Mike Keas as we look into the question of scientism. And if you like what you see tonight, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And as you know, we are a non-profit organization, so please feel free to go onto our website, click on the donate button, and send us something if you feel like it. All right. So, as I have mentioned, tonight we have the privilege of having Dr. Mike Keas with us to talk about Is Only Science Reliable? A Critique of Scientism. Dr. Keas will be presenting for about 45 minutes to an hour or so. And you, as the live audience, will have the opportunity to post any questions you have on live stream on the YouTube at any time during the presentation. And at the end of the presentation, I'll field them to Dr. Keas to answer. At least we'll try to get the most of the questions that we can. All right, so let me introduce our guest. Michael Newton Keas, author of the book Unbelievable, 7 Myths About the History and Future of Science and Religion, holds a doctorate in the history of science from the University of Oklahoma. He has received research grants from several organizations, including the National Science Foundation and the American Council of Learned Societies. He is a senior fellow at Discovery Institute and a former Fulbright scholar. Dr. Keas serves as a lecturer in the history and philosophy of science at Biola University and is on the board of directors of Ratio Christi, a network of apologetic clubs on college campuses. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Dr. Keas to do his presentation for us for tonight. Thank you, Dr. Keas.
Thank you so much, Rudy, and RC South Africa for inviting me to interact with you today. So I'm going to share some slides with you, and let's see if we go. Let's see, new share. Let's try it again. For some reason, all right. Can you see the slides now, Rudy? All right.
Yes, I can see them.
Okay, very good. In a course in the philosophy of science that I teach at Biola University, I use a textbook by leading philosopher of science Alex Rosenberg, pictured here. And his textbook is quite good, although I do critique it at points. And but earlier he wrote a book called The Atheist Guide to Reality. And in that book, he claims that science is our exclusive guide to reality. And he calls this scientism, which is the standard term for the belief that science is the only way to have rational beliefs about anything. And he says that this scientism is the worldview of atheists like himself. And so the worldview of scientism, according to Rosenberg's, of course, says there's no God, but it also answers a lot of other related questions. What is the nature of reality? The answer, what physics says it is. What is the purpose of the universe? There is none. Why am I here? Just dumb luck. Is there free will? Not a chance. And those are all quotes from his book, The Atheist Guide to Reality. And he tries to provide, of course, arguments to support these points. But I want to focus on what he and what is standardly in the literature called scientism. Now, that's not science, but it's scientism. Scientism is the philosophical view. It's actually within the branch of the theory of knowledge or epistemology, that science is our only way to get at truth. Now, in this list of questions and answers that he gives, for example, when he says, what is the nature of reality? Well, it's just whatever physics says it is. Well, physics can do a great job at analyzing a certain level or aspect of reality, namely the physical, and with it, of course, mathematical and other quantitative characteristics of reality, as well as a number of others that are related to physics. But physics is not equipped at all to really address what is a living organism, or what does it mean to be a physicist, that is a conscious agent who can do science. So physics is really lousy at addressing questions above it, such as biological questions or the nature of a human scientist who can even do physics in the first place. So it's very restrictive artificially to say that the only thing that's real is what physics can investigate. So anyway, and notice that the last talking point on this slide, it occurs a little later in the book, but Rosenberg makes the statement that natural selection, that is the Darwinian mechanism proposed to explain the origin of life, or the origin of major kinds of life, including humans, produces lots of false but useful beliefs. That is, in the heads of humans and proto-humans, as they were allegedly evolving toward humanity. And so, of course, that leaves open the big question that if Rosenberg's worldview were true, how would he know it? Since he sort of cut off the limb that he's sitting on here by saying that natural selection produces lots of false but useful beliefs. Now, of course, he wants to target religious beliefs as the main false beliefs that natural selection produced, that, that religion was somehow useful for survival and so on. But it's not really true. It just helped people perpetuate their genes. But once you let the cat out of the bag here, really, if you have this scientific worldview, there really is no foundation for rationality of any kind, including scientific rationality, let alone rationality in other domains, such as the domain of human history or theology or other subjects. So as you can see, there's some problems with scientism that emerged even from just looking at a leading proponent of scientism, Alex Rosenberg. But let's dig a little deeper. And so when I ask the question, is only science reasonable? I'm essentially asking, is scientism true? That is the philosophical view that science is the only reasonable discipline, and of course they usually target religion as the paradigm example of unreasonableness. Is this view true, that only science and not religion is reasonable? Well, I want to address this question by three main points. I want to show that scientism is supported by fake stories of Christianity at war with science. That is, it's not really well supported. I mean, if the stories are fake, then this support is pseudo support. I also want to show that scientism ignores how Christianity has played a positive role in stimulating the growth of modern science. And then lastly, I'll show that scientism assumes that there's no rational way to evaluate religion. And I'm going to specifically apply this to Christianity. Is there a way to rationally evaluate the truth claims of Christianity? All right, so we'll take all three of these points in turn. And let's start with the fake history stories. One of these is that a big universe became a problem for Christianity. Now, some of you in South Africa have heard me give some of these slides before, but I've now set them in a whole new context. And so take note of how this myth, which I call the big myth, has been used to support scientism, and to do so in an illegitimate manner. Okay. All right, so let's tackle the big myth. So Bill Nye expresses it well when he once said, "I'm insignificant. I'm just another speck of sand. And the Earth really, in the cosmic scheme of things, is another speck. And the sun, an unremarkable star. and the galaxy is a speck, and I'm a speck on a speck, orbiting a speck among other specks, among still other specks in the middle of specklessness. I suck. All right. So Nye has a great sense of humor, of course, but the point that he's making here is that because the universe is so big and humans in relation to the universe are so small, that he tries to make the point that humans are not significant in any traditionally religious sense, because he goes on in this same talk to say, well, we are significant because, well, look, we can do science. We've made all kinds of discoveries, such as the cosmological discoveries about our position in the universe listed in this quotation, and much more. So he's really attacking the religious sense of significance and saying that it can't stand up to a huge universe. So that's part of what I call the big myth. Now, how is it a myth? Well, part of the myth says that it was only modern science that showed how big the universe is, and that this thereby critiqued earlier religious versions of what a human is and our place in the universe. But as we go back into history, we'll find, as you see from this quote, from this bit of Hebrew poetry, that the ancient Hebrews had as part of their background knowledge that the universe was very big. As the psalmist writes, for as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his, that is God's steadfast love toward those who fear him. So obviously the psalmist thinks the universe is very big because he's comparing the greatness of God's love with the greatness of cosmic size. Ancient non-Christians, such as the pagan brilliant scientist Claudius Ptolemy, also thought the universe was very, very big. And he said the Earth is like a tiny point compared to the distance to the stars. So in this illustration, that little circle in the middle representing Earth should be shrunken down to virtually invisible, he argued, compared to the distance to the stars. So he thought the universe was really, really big. Now, C.S. Lewis nicely helps us to further debunk the big myth in noting, and he was a scholar of literature, including scientific and religious literature. He noted that space feels infinite to humans, really of all ages. You just look out and it just seems like space goes on and on and on. What space really is beside the point here. Whether it's finite or infinite, it feels infinite to us. And many ancient people imagined a very large, if not infinite, cosmos. Now, he then went through the various possibilities. Since we seem to live in a very big place, what if there were no objects visible to us except the sun and the moon? So here we have an Earth, we've got the sun and the moon, and that's it. Well, if that were the case, the atheist would object and say something like this: well, no God would create lots of wasted empty space. Why create all this space and just have a couple of objects in it? But if there are objects in space other than the sun and the moon, which obviously there are, Lewis writes there are a number of possibilities. They must be habitable or uninhabitable. And the odd thing is that both these hypotheses are used to reject Christianity. Now, what he goes on to argue then is the atheist could easily take the option of, well, if there's billions of habitable planets, and spin that to say, look, humans aren't special because we're lost in a crowd of aliens. Or if the opposite were true, if there were billions of planets out there, almost all of which were uninhabitable, then the atheist could easily say, well, no God would create huge numbers of sterile planets. I mean, that looks like lousy design. So what's really interesting here is this big myth, as I call it, the idea that a big universe became a problem for belief in God, is really misguided, the whole storyline, because part of the storyline says, well, ancient religious people and medieval religious people thought the universe was small, therefore humans were of large significance in a small universe. And that's not true historically, because ancient religious people in the Western tradition, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, thought the universe was big, very big. And they get the, even if you just fast forward to contemporary thought about the size of the universe and human significance, like Bill Nye, it's clear that there's a rigged game that they've set up here, and it's a metaphysical game rigging. It's a heads I win, tails you lose. Whether there's whether the billions of planets out there are habitable largely or almost all uninhabitable, either way, heads or tails, God loses because the atheist has rigged the game metaphysically. And of course, metaphysics is the study of what is. And so whatever we find, what is the case, turns out to be an argument against God, which goes to show that it's a rigged game. It's not really a serious argument because no matter, I mean, if God does exist, and if he did make the universe, no matter how he could have made the universe with lots of planets, with few planets, with lots of life, with very little life, maybe even humans are the only biological life of possessing intelligence. Regardless of what is actually the case, the atheist can easily make it an excuse for saying God doesn't exist, that no self-respecting God would have done it that way. So given that regardless, there's really no clear diagnostic for telling whether or not God exists, it's just a little game they're playing, I call this a metaphysical game rigging. Now, there's also an epistemological game rigging that can occur, and that's really what scientism is all about. So now we're coming back to the topic of scientism and so showing how it is another kind of rigged game. In this case, it's saying that only science is rational. Now, if there's an objection, I mean, the most obvious objection is, look, if scientism is the philosophical belief that only science is rational, I mean, you can't discover that only science is rational by looking through a telescope or microscope or by coming up with scientific evidence and arguments. It's an assumption that lies behind what you take to be the significance of science, and that's a philosophical assumption. So scientism, in effect, is the belief that is the philosophical belief that non-scientific arguments like philosophy aren't rational. Well, that would undermine itself. That would be self-defeating. And if this objection of the self-defeating nature of scientism has been launched by many people, but a recent reply that I've encountered, and I've published a research paper about this, is to claim that philosophy is a kind of science. But as I argue in my essay, this an objection to this reply would be to say, look, if your philosophy, which you claim is a kind of science, assumes from the get-go that there's no way to test whether God exists, therefore, thinking about whether God exists or not is just a matter of subjective belief and is not testable in anything that's similar to science or similar to the kind of philosophy that would count as something very, very much like science. It's testable. Arguments can be made for and against any proposition and so on. Well, then you've rigged the game. If you've simply defined the opposition as, anyone who believes that the notion of God is something that is knowledge, that won't count as knowledge because the very idea is not testable. So in other words, it's heads, I win, tails, you lose. Heads, that is the person who believes in scientism and says that philosophy is a kind of science, he wins because he says it's a testable kind of knowledge. Whereas tails, you lose because your integration of philosophy, science, and history for that matter, which is what a Christian would argue is our view, is untestable because Christians take into account, as especially Ratio Christi does, as Rudy introduced me, we are interested in historical, philosophical, and scientific arguments that help people to decide whether or not God exists. Well, those are three ways of testing the God hypothesis: philosophy, theology, and science, and history for that matter. So, and a great example of this, of course, is the question of whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. This claim that Christians made from the very beginning of Christianity, that they had eyewitness reports of the resurrected Jesus Christ, can be tested by as you look at the historical facts that we still have available to us today. And this has been done by a number of scholars, So the question, did the resurrection of Jesus happen? That is, comparing the God raised Jesus theory with various naturalistic theories can be done. And the way to do that is to look at the minimal set of facts that, by and large, most scholars, regardless of whether they're atheists or Jews or whatever, or Christians, New Testament scholars, what they think are the basic facts that need to be explained. And these are mainly three. You could add a fourth one, namely that the Romans crucified Jesus and the Jews were involved with this procedure that is leading up to it. But there's three other main facts, and I have them listed here: that the tomb somehow got empty. Second, that there were people who said they saw Jesus. There were a lot of them who claimed to have experience of a resurrected Jesus. That is, a bodily resurrected Jesus, who they could see and touch. And thirdly, that the disciples, and that is the early followers of Jesus, believed in a bodily resurrection in the absence of sufficient resurrection expectations from people at that time. In other words, the disciples and people in other religious sects at the time weren't expecting this kind of resurrection to happen at all at this time. Many Jews thought something like this would happen at the very end of time to all those who followed God, but not in the middle of history like this. So you can then evaluate what many take to be fairly well attested facts of history, these three facts, and try to figure out which kind of theory best explains these three facts. Do various naturalistic theories better explain these than the God raised Jesus from the dead theory? And of course, we could run through various theories. I'm just going to give an example, a kind of a generic conspiracy theory versus God raised Jesus, and look at two criteria by which you could evaluate naturalistic theories like a conspiracy theory with the Christian claim that God raised Jesus. And the first category of evaluation would be evidential accuracy. That's the most obvious thing that any theory needs to do. It needs to make sense of whatever evidence is known at the time that the theory is initially constructed. And conspiracy theories really score low in this for several reasons, one of which is that we have good reason to think the tomb was well guarded, and it would be very hard to steal the body. And you could run through a lot of other ways you could get a conspiracy theory going. But anyway, evidential accuracy is one of the criterion for evaluation. A second criterion is causal adequacy. And these are ways of evaluating basically any kind of theory, whether it's a theory in philosophy or history or in science. And I've written an essay about this in regards to particularly the natural sciences, but many of these apply to other disciplines like human history. And of course, the question of whether Jesus was raised from the dead is a question of human history. And so causal adequacy is simply, does the cause proposed by a particular theory, is it known to have the resources to be able to bring about the effect that needs to be explained? So the effect could be something like, well, somehow you have people willing to suffer for the resurrection message. Some of them actually martyred, but many more of them suffered for this. So is self-interest causally adequate to produce a conspiracy? Well, in some cases it is. Self-interest of a small group of people could motivate them to get together and concoct a false religion, or to concoct something that's not true. But in the case of the resurrection message, many of the early proclaimers of the resurrection message suffered a lot for this resurrection message, including martyrdom in some cases. Now, it's not in your self-interest to suffer for the message of the resurrection of Jesus if it's a lie that you've made. If it's a lie that you know is a lie, that doesn't give a causally adequate reason for you to engage in creating a conspiracy if you know it's a lie, if you know the resurrection is a lie. because they were willing to suffer for this message. It wasn't really in their self-interest um, if the resurrection didn't really happen. Now, a real resurrection would be causally adequate and would be a causally adequate explanation for how many early Christians were persecuted and some of them martyred. Because if Jesus really did rise from the dead and they witnessed that, then that would mean, as the Apostle Paul and others argued, there's a whole lot of things that follow from that Jesus conquered death, that he's this second person of the Trinity, and all that got worked out by the church over a couple of centuries. But very early on, within the living memory of the death of Jesus, people believed in the resurrection and proclaimed that. So scientism, remember, is the view that only science and not religion and many other disciplines is rational and reasonable. And scientism often spins these war stories like, well, religion gets in the way of science. Religion hinders the development of science, or religion hinders the evaluative testing procedures of science. But here we've seen that you can evaluate a core claim in Christianity, namely whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. You can evaluate this by looking at historical evidence. So Christianity is not a hindrance to the evaluative procedures used in the sciences and in the discipline of human history and the discipline of philosophy, but it actually invites testing. Okay, and now I want to give an example from the history of science and its relation to Christianity to further show that the history of science defeats this claim that Christianity hinders the development of the evaluative or testing methods of science. And this is what I call the flat myth. So we looked at the big myth. Now let's look at the flat myth. And the flat myth is the historical thesis that medieval Christians thought the earth was flat, and that it was because of the corrosive influence of religion, namely the church, that had such great influence on Western society, that led people to believe the earth was flat instead of round. Now, how many of you were taught that Europeans thought earth was flat until Columbus showed it was round? That's a very common thing that's still in the textbooks. Turns out this is not right. This is false. Medieval students, that is students in the universities before Columbus, 1492, studied this subject of Earth's shape. And it was a standard part of astronomy to learn arguments for a spherical Earth. And here are some of the ones that they studied and could argue from this evidence to the conclusion that Earth is probably spherical. One of the arguments is that during a lunar eclipse, if you look at the edge of the shadow, it's curved in such a way that leads us to believe that the object casting that shadow, namely the Earth, is curved. And if you see enough lunar eclipse, and you always see a curved edge, it would help motivate the conclusion that the Earth is curved all the way around, namely into a circular object, a spherical object in all three dimensions. Another argument for a spherical Earth that medieval students knew, that is, Christians in these institutions of higher education that spent about a third of their curriculum looking at science and mathematics, which is a higher proportion than most undergraduates today study. That is in their general education. So one of the other arguments is that the North Star appears higher and higher in the sky as you travel further and further north. So and it roughly turns out to be roughly for every 1,000 miles you travel north on the planet, the North Star appears about 15 degrees higher above your horizon until when you finally get to the North Pole, of course, it's directly over your head. So these are clear examples of how Christians in the universities, and we're talking hundreds of thousands of people who were educated in Europe through the late Middle Ages, they learned that there's ways to evaluate whether or not the Earth is spherical or flat, and they had good reasons to believe in a spherical Earth. So these universities, which were funded by the Christian church and promoted by them, these universities promoted the evaluative methods of science. So the church is not hindering the development of these evaluative methods, but it's actually promoting institutions that help hundreds of thousands of people to learn about these evaluative methods and to have a reasonable worldview that integrated everything that they could know from observation and from looking at historical texts, because even Aristotle knew about this kind of thing, and they knew Aristotle knew about these arguments, and they were also using these arguments in the Middle Ages. So scientism tries to support itself by claiming that religion, particularly Christianity, hinders the development of the evaluative methods of science. But as we've seen, and I could give many other examples, as I do in my book, the history of science really defeats this. And I gave an example of the contemporary discussion among scholars, historians, and philosophers about, did the resurrection of Jesus happen or did it not? That these different theories are evaluable. That is, they can be evaluated by means of what are called the theory virtues or theoretical virtues, like evidential accuracy and causal adequacy. These are two of the about dozen major theory virtues that you can evaluate scientific theories by, as well as theories about human history. Many of these apply to the study of human history as well, such as whether the resurrection happened or not. So scientism, we see, has some serious problems with it, including the most recent defenses of it, which I evaluate in my 2021 article on this topic. So the scientism is claiming that only science and anti-religious philosophy are rational. That is, anti-religious philosophy, the kind of philosophy that assumes that religion can't be evaluated by the theoretical virtues, which of course is false. So scientism is really a very flimsy worldview, because there's great arguments against it. But scientism, when you look at scientism as the belief that only science is reasonable, and you add to it a lot of these different fake war stories about science and Christianity allegedly being perpetually in conflict with each other, what you get when you combine scientism with these fake war stories is what I call the scientistic warfare myth. And that is a storyline that says science is always at odds with religion, and this is why science is our only reasonable way of getting at truth, which is scientism. So you put that all together and you get what I call the scientistic warfare myth. So scientism, I think, can be defeated by a number of different arguments. I've given you just a couple of examples. And you can Google scientism and my last name, Keas, and find the essay that I referred to. It's the first thing that comes up when you Google that. And if you are interested in the 12 major virtues of a good theory, and I study this particularly as it applies to the natural sciences, but as I've shown, many of these apply to the study of human history. Well, just Google virtues Keas, and you'll find that essay. And if you're interested in my book and the videos about the book, then just Google Unbelievable Keas, and there you've got it. Now, I want to give you another little snippet, another argument from the history of science that further counts against the story of scientism, because it shows how scientism ignores how Christianity has stimulated science. So I've sort of given the debunk the negative part of the argument, the negative part, the war stories. Hey, Christianity's always been at war with science. I've shown that that's not the case. There's really not good support for that. Now let's look at the other side of the coin, which would be, is there positive evidence of Christianity actually making contributions to the background knowledge that made science something that people wanted to pursue and that actually helped to guide scientists in their scientific inquiry? And I think the answer is yes. And I want to give just one little example of that from the life of the very renowned astronomer Johannes Kepler, who lived at the time of Galileo. So we're talking mostly their work was in the early 17th century. So this would be after the Middle Ages. This would be the early modern period. Well, the the thing that Kepler is most remembered for today in astronomy textbooks, still used in education today, would be what are now called his 3 laws of planetary motion. The first law is that planets don't move in circular orbits around the sun, but in elliptical ones, and with the sun at one of the 2 foci. The second and third laws give details as to how the planets do this, and there are certain regularities, mathematical regularities that they exhibit. Now, Kepler, while he was doing the work that led to these discoveries, in a letter he wrote, he contrasted his approach to science with that of the ancient pagan Aristotle, who, and this is now quoting Kepler, who that Aristotle did not believe that the world had been created and thus could not recognize the mathematical design plans for the material world, because without an architect, there is no such power in mathematics to make anything material. The parts that are not in quotes are simply my summary of Kepler, because Kepler's prose is very, very difficult to follow. So this is the most concise way to accurately say what Kepler's claimed here in this passage. So in other words, what Kepler is saying here is that mathematics itself can't do anything. It can't make a universe. But mathematics, if we can discover mathematical rules that operate in the physical world, well, that is, he says in this next quotation, that's acceptable to me and to all Christians, since our faith holds that the world was created by God in weight, measure, and number. That is, in accordance with ideas co-eternal with him. Now, this is a very rich quotation. Let's unpack it. Basically, he's saying mathematics exists in the mind of God, mathematical principles, that we can study through various theorems and proofs, but that God selected some of these to instantiate into the physical world in the form of natural laws, like the law of gravitation that takes a very specific mathematical form. And that humans, particularly scientists, because we're made in God's image, we have the ability to discover these laws, and thus share in his own thoughts, quoting Kepler. That is, we can share in the thoughts of God because we have a mind that's somewhat like the mind of God. Of course, we're not omniscient, we don't know everything, but we can think rationally, we can draw conclusions from evidence, and we can draw conclusions that are, that unveil the mathematical structure of natural laws, which are in effect discovering the mathematical principles that God imagined in his mind could be used to construct a physical cosmos by mathematical rules, and that we can thus share in God's own thoughts as he was creating the universe. Even though God was free to make many different kinds of universes, he did decide to make at least this one that we live in. And because he was free to make the universe many different ways, many of the early modern scientists realized you couldn't simply deduce one way that God had to do it. You had to consider many possible, let's say, mathematical formula that might apply to the way planets go about the sun and other such celestial phenomena. And so you have to test various possibilities to see which one best fits the evidence. And in fact, Kepler did test quite a number of closed curve figures besides the ellipse as an alternative to the traditional circle. And he found that the ellipse best fit the data that he had at hand. And so that procedure in science of multiple competing hypotheses and then using evidence to help you to eliminate the false ones and to conclude which one is most likely true, that whole procedure of testing multiple hypotheses by the evidence was motivated in part by the Christian doctrine of creation, that God was free to make many different possible universes. He made this one, so we need to test multiple possible ways that he could have made this universe, like different kinds of natural laws that govern gravity or planetary motion, and then figure out which one best explains the evidence. Now, another way in which biblical Christianity helped to guide science was there's in some rare cases, and this is extremely rare, there are specific utterances in Scripture that did rub up against science in very particular ways. For example, in Psalm 102, we read that the psalmist says that the stars and planets will perish, but that you, God, will remain. They will all wear out like a garment. Now, Kepler actually alludes specifically to this verse, and he noted that in his own lifetime, scientists were discovering more and more evidence that the heavens were corruptible. They were subject to change, and the appearance of comets that were in the sky, and a number of other arguments were used. For example, supernovae, the appearance of new stars, or at least the apparent appearance of new stars. There was some kind of change happening in the heavens that was at least similar to changes on Earth. And therefore, this was part of an argument for a unification of heaven and earth, that the same laws that apply to the earth also apply to the heavens. And this was in sharp contrast to Aristotle's view that the heavens were governed by a completely different set of natural laws than the earthly realm. And so the unity of the heavens and the earth, which is so important to modern science, that the whole cosmos is governed by the same natural laws, no matter where you go in the cosmos, whether you're on the earth or in the earth's atmosphere or far away from the earth, that this unity of heaven and earth was in part motivated by Christian theology. And in some cases, that Christian theology had particular verses that were out of sync with ancient pagan science, Aristotle's science, and helped motivate a development in science that we will recognize as more in keeping with modern science. So that's very interesting thing to note. So some lessons we've learned here is that just by looking at one prominent early modern scientist, Johannes Kepler, it helps to undercut the idea that science and Christianity are at war, and it gives the positive alternative that in some cases you can have evidence of scientists who were guided by their theological knowledge to make scientific discoveries, and Johannes Kepler is a good example of that. Okay, Galileo is another example of this, and I won't go into detail other than to say that Galileo claimed that the book of nature is written in mathematical language, and he compared the book of nature to the book of scripture. Galileo thought that both books are authored by God, and that both we can discover truth about reality by means of examining both books, the book of the Bible and the book of nature, and that both have sort of languages associated with them that help us, once we learn those languages, let's say Hebrew and Greek or mathematics, it helps us to be better interpreters of the book of scripture and the book of nature. And this was part of Galileo's trail of discovery to find things such as his rules for free fall acceleration. And there's an earlier history to that as well, of how other theological ideas help to bring about the discovery of things like inertia and free fall acceleration and so on. One of those theological ideas is the very idea of natural laws themselves, has some of its roots in the Judeo-Christian tradition. For example, in Jeremiah, we read that, thus says the Lord, who gives the sun for light by day and the fixed order of the moon and the stars for light by night. If this fixed order departs from before me, declares the Lord, then shall the offspring of Israel cease from being a nation before me forever. And the part in bold, fixed order, is the Hebrew hoch, and it means royal decree or law. And this, as it entered into Latin, which was the international language of the time of intellectuals in the medieval and early modern periods, this helped to give rise to the idea of natural laws. So I think that's a fascinating example. So I'll conclude by, again, revisiting the question, is only science reasonable, which is, of course, the view of scientism, which a leading philosopher of science, Rosenberg, says is the worldview of atheists, at least his kind of atheism. And scientism, of course, is the view that indeed only science and not religion is reasonable. And I've argued that this very view is unreasonable. The view that only science is reasonable is itself unreasonable for three reasons. Because it gets illegitimate support from stories of Christianity at war with science. That is, it appeals to the history of science, but it does so in a way that is not in sync with contemporary scholarship in the history of science, which shows that these stories are really fake stories, by and large. So that's the first way in which I'm arguing against scientism. The second way is that scientism ignores how Christianity has helped to stimulate the growth of science. And I gave Kepler as an example, and you could also go into Galileo into more detail to show that as well. Thirdly, scientism assumes that there's no way to really rationally evaluate religion. And I've given the question of whether Jesus rose from the dead as a great example of where you can rationally evaluate certain components of Christianity, particularly the central component that was the reason that the early church even got started in the first place, because it was based on proclaiming what they called the gospel, or the good news that Jesus rose from the dead. And they put their lives at stake for this. Many of them suffered dearly, not just prejudice, but against them, but they were excluded from many opportunities, and some of them actually killed for this belief. Yeah, clearly, this is a good argument that the resurrection actually happened. So you can evaluate whether certain components of the Christian religion. In fact, I would argue that Christianity is the most testable of all religions, but that's a whole other topic for another study. Now, you might object, well, what about the Dark Ages, the 1,000+ years when the church held back science, allegedly? Or what about Galileo's encounter with the Catholic Church? Doesn't that show there was really that the church was against science? Well, I'll address these two topics in another talk that I'll give soon for Ratio Christi South Africa. But let's just stop at that for now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Keas, for that. Okay, we have some questions coming in. First one is a common objection or remark is that, yes, science can't give us knowledge of everything, but it is the best that we have. Mm-hmm. How would you respond to that?
Well, science clearly is, the natural sciences clearly are the best way to answer certain kinds of questions about, what are the most important characteristics of a living organism? Well, metabolism, reproduction, things like that. What is how big is the universe? What is the shape of the earth? Science is the best way to answer these kinds of questions. It gives us our best knowledge about those kinds of questions. But what about questions like, how is it possible for scientists to actually do science in the first place? To have, how do we explain human consciousness and the ability to reason? Well, the natural sciences of physics, chemistry, biology, they can help, particularly when you get to the level of biology, they can help explain how a human brain works. But brain states, molecules in the brain are not about anything. A little molecule in your brain is not about an idea like the shape of the earth or modern cosmology. It's about nothing. It's just a molecule. But human consciousness interacts with the brain. It's a two-way street, brain and human mind. And I think human consciousness is a good argument. It is something that the natural sciences can't explain. Now, cognitive science can explain certain things about the operation of the brain, but you still have to explain the continuity of personal identity over time, that there is a me, if I'm a scientist, over my lifetime of scientific research, it's the same me, even though most of the parts of my body were replaced multiple times in my lifetime. There's not a material explanation for the personal continuity of me, the scientist, over time. And then questions of, did Jesus rise from the dead? That's a historical question. Now, the discipline of human history is still a rational discipline. Even if you concluded that the naturalistic theories are better than that God raised Jesus from the dead, it's still a question of human history, not the natural sciences, to determine whether Caesar Augustus really lived and whether he fought certain wars, of whether Cicero really existed, and did he really write these things that we now take to be his writings? Those are historical questions. The natural sciences can't address that at all. So it all depends on the kind of subject matter. When it comes to matters of human history, when it comes to matters of human consciousness, these are best addressed by other disciplines, although sometimes in conversation with the natural sciences. You need to take into account the human brain to account for human consciousness. It's part of the story, but it's not the whole story. So I think the natural sciences are the best approach for the kinds of questions for kinds of questions like, how what are the characteristics of life? How does physiology work? How did the universe develop from the initial beginning to the present? Those are addressed well by the natural sciences. But there's a lot of other things that we have good reason to know are real, such as questions of human history. The natural sciences can't address that, but our best knowledge about human history would be to go through the tools of historiography, which is the discipline of human history, which the natural sciences really can't get at.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, next one. Would the fact that science deals with repeatable and testable phenomena serve as a basis for belief in scientism, even if your rejection of the wartime stories is granted?
Yeah, good question. Well, it depends on which kind of natural science. There are some areas of natural science where there's the repeatability of experiments, but there's other areas of natural science that don't involve repeatability, particularly the historical parts of the natural science. Now, I'm using historical parts of science not to refer to human history, but to refer to natural history. That is, that nature itself has a history. There hasn't always been an Earth. There hasn't always been a cosmos. There hasn't always been our galaxy. Somehow the universe came into being. Somehow the universe, through billions of years, has come to its present state with our galaxy and our sun and our planet Earth. So those questions are questions about the history of nature, and it's still a part of the natural sciences, but it involves, although repeatable experiments are a part of the analysis of these, such as, let's say, origin of life studies, the Miller-Urey experiment with assuming certain gases available on the early Earth. Can you get amino acids? Yes, you can. But of course, that gives you certain answers, but you still have to look at, is there historical evidence in nature that Earth had the right kind of atmosphere that was assumed by the Miller-Urey experiment? And recent evidence shows that the atmosphere of the early Earth was quite different than that. And so these kinds of things. So repeatable experiments are important for certain parts of the natural sciences, but not for all. Cosmology, the study of the history of the cosmos, involves some repeatable experiments, but a lot of other kinds of evidence and arguments that aren't directly from repeatable experiments. And the similar thing could be said for human history. In the case of human history, there's certain things that we can kind of know about humans and how they usually operate from the social sciences, from psychology and sociology. But when it comes to human history, you can apply some of that repeatable experiments on, let's say, the nature of human motivation, or nature of human even political science is a kind of science. How do humans tend to behave in certain groups, politically, economically, and so on. These are all social sciences, and some of that involves repeatable experiments. But when it comes to applying these to human history, you still have other things that are not repeatable, like say artifacts that you dig up. You can't, it's just unique objects that you dig up, kind of like fossils in the case of natural history, and you can't repeat it. You're simply finding a piece of pottery or an inscription on a stone, and you can infer certain things about what was happening at that time. And but you a lot of human history involves non-repeatable things. So that's true of human history, that's true of natural history. And so many disciplines involve both certain aspects that are repeatable, certain aspects that are not. And so when it comes to the Christian faith, we have good reasons to believe that Jesus rose from the dead based on kind of what we know about what would sufficiently motivate someone to let's say, lie or not lie about an event. And I kind of worked that into my earlier presentation. But we also, there are unique things like the documentary evidence for the New Testament manuscripts. Those are things we've found, and they're now in archives and museums all around the world. And those are not repeatable, but they are things that exist today. You can examine them, and you can date the Gospels to the first century for the most part. So that kind of thing is what historians do. And of course, as a historian of science and as a philosopher of science, I'm interested in how certain academic work involves repeatability, and some aspects of academic work don't involve repeatable experiments. It's still all rational, though, and reasonable.
Okay, thank you. Next one. Okay, so scientism is problematic, but how is the Christian approach better? One can posit a supernatural cause to justify anything. Isn't it just the gods of the gaps?
Excellent question. Yeah, so one might think that, well, if you're positing God as an explanation, well, if God can do anything, then does that really, how would you, is there any way to distinguish between a God hypothesis and a non-God hypothesis? Well, of course, I think there are ways to do that. For example, Stephen Meyer, my colleague at Discovery Institute, in his most recent book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, what he does is he says, look, in his earlier books, let's say Darwin's Doubt and The Signature in the Cell, he was dealing with the origin of life question and signature. He was dealing with the origin of the major kinds of life in Darwin's Doubt. There he restricted himself to just the natural sciences. And there he argued that all you can infer is there was an intelligent agent that did it. Now, whether that intelligent agent was natural or supernatural, it's hard to tell from just those areas of science. But in his latest book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, he shows that when you add to his earlier arguments further evidence about and arguments from philosophy, looking at what worldview would best explain the origin of a universe, when it looks like the origin of space, time, and matter is part of that origin, that before the origin there was no space, time, and matter, or for that matter, before the origin of the multiverse, if you want to go that way. However you got the multiverse or our universe, it requires an adequate cause for that effect of what we see. And although natural science can suggest somewhat that we need, well, at least we need a cause that's beyond space, time, and matter in the case of the origin of the universe. And that does sound strikingly like the God described in the Bible. But of course, it would require additional arguments beyond natural science, arguments from philosophy and so on, and from history, to further specify whether you can best argue it was a supernatural God, and if that's the case, who is that supernatural God? Is it which religion has the right God? And of course, the resurrection arguments helps to specify that it's the God who raised Jesus from the dead as the best explanation. So even though it might be objected that, well, the God hypothesis can explain anything, you can still fruitfully and very rationally distinguish between what would we expect to find about the universe, or about the current evidence about what happened after Jesus' death, whether if God existed and he caused the resurrection, or if God existed and he caused the origin of the universe, and what would we expect if no God existed? We would expect somehow nature to have its own explanation. We would expect a good explanation of an empty tomb without God, and so on. So there are actually ways to rationally distinguish the God hypothesis from the non-God hypothesis. So I think that goes a long way toward answering that very, very good question.
Thank you. All right. Here's a question about, can you name some of the most influential Christian scientists?
Yes. So besides Johannes Kepler, who, by the way, is like my all-time favorite, the guy, I'll just give you one more detail. Johannes Kepler almost finished a terminal degree in theology, that is a doctoral degree. But his advisors said, hey, look, there's this new job as a mathematician, which included astronomy. Why don't you take it? We think you're really gifted for that. And Kepler went ahead and took the position, but he, in his technical monographs, like the book where he published what we now call his two of his laws of planetary motion, he occasionally will break out in, let's say, praise to God. He talks about his faith in God and how he praises God that he was able to make these discoveries and so on. And in his personal letters, he does this. It wasn't just window dressing to appeal to a religious audience. It shows that Johannes Kepler personally was devoted to Jesus Christ. And so, yeah, I think Galileo, you know, and you could just go down this huge list. You know, Isaac Newton believed in the Bible, believed in God. He had an unorthodox view of Christ, but he considered himself a Christian. And you could go on and on. Robert Boyle, who made some discoveries about how gases operate, and he was not only a Christian, but he actually was a big promoter of Christian apologetics, of defending the Christian faith, and so on. One of Darwin's contemporaries, Louis Agassiz, was arguably America's leading scientist in the time of Darwin, and he argued against Darwin's theory, and he believed in God. So, yeah, and I think you can find many more examples in my book. Unbelievable.
Thank you so much. Okay. Another one. In the battle between modernism and postmodernism, some postmodernists appeal to Thomas Kuhn's work to argue that science is not as secure as we think it to be. What was Kuhn's idea?
Yes, Thomas Kuhn wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions in 1962. Happens to be the year I was born, so I remember it. Now Kuhn has often been read to have a very relativistic view of truth and to be a kind of an incipient postmodern thinker. Kuhn actually himself later distanced himself from those readings of his own book. And in fact, if you Google virtues Keas and look at my essay on theoretical virtues, I actually cite Thomas Kuhn as an example of someone who did believe in the rationality of science, despite some of the postmodern, excessively postmodern readings of his book. And Kuhn kind of vacillated a little bit in his own lifetime, but he did argue that there were enduring kinds of traits of theories that you can use to evaluate whether a theory is likely true or false. And of the 12 major theory virtues that I outline and go into great detail in my essay, about 4 or 5 of them were known by Thomas Kuhn. And he said, these are enduring features of science. No conceivable scientific revolution in the future would actually overthrow these basic categories of how you evaluate whether a theory is a good theory or a bad theory. And so I think that now there are some postmodern implications of some of Kuhn's work, but subsequent scholarship, and of course there's been a whole lot done on this since 1962, has shown that, I mean, look, most philosophers of science don't buy into a complete anything goes anti-realism postmodernism. Most philosophers of science subscribe to at least some form of critical realism, that yes, there are some subjective aspects to science, but there still are some enduring aspects of science that are objective and that do promote likely truth. Maybe not absolute truth, but likely truth.
Okay, good, thanks. So here's a question about a general trust or distrust about scientific authorities. So, and there's two examples. In today's time, we have the COVID situation, and there are these scientific authorities that give science as the rule of day, and there are many objections and people who trust and distrust, and that could be partly due to political situations or not. And there's another example of a recent hoax that was done from James Lindsay, Helen Pluckrose, and Peter Boghossian, who wrote 20 fake papers in a scientific journal about gender studies and so forth, and they basically did a lot of weird things, and I think they even used passages from Hitler's Mein Kampf and just added some words in, and it was accepted in some peer-reviewed journals. And the question really here is, I don't know, I know you don't have a crystal ball in front of you, but if you had one, would you say that the general trust or distrust or would you say the general trust in science and scientific authorities would increase, or are we leaning towards a more postmodern view that it's going to decline going forward?
Yes. Well, regarding COVID, I would defer to my wife, who's a nurse practitioner. I'm a doctor of the wrong kind. I'm a doctor of the mind, not of the body. So, but I do know enough about COVID from talking with my wife that there have been various. There is a minority opinion about COVID, and I would say that, and about different policies, and there is a lot of political aspects to this, of course. So I would acknowledge that there are certain subjective elements to the practice of science and scientific technology, which, the vaccine, the masks, and all that. There's an example of what do you do? What's the best practice to try to limit, human suffering and death due to this pandemic? So I would encourage the dialogue among my minority and majority viewpoints. I tend to think that the majority viewpoint is probably more right in this case, but I would think it's important for minority viewpoints on these COVID issues to be expressed and to be discussed and debated. I think it's very good. Now, when it comes to this, the hoax of regarding the gender studies, I familiar with that, and there was also an earlier hoax a couple decades ago that was started by Alan Sokal, who submitted an essay to a very trendy postmodern journal about where he was arguing for the social construction of the particular aspects of the natural sciences in his own area of physics, and he created this totally bogus theory that was all about how gender and ethnicity and all that socially constructed certain scientific theories, and it was total baloney. Okay, and it got published in this very trendy postmodern sort of cultural studies journal that included the cultural study of science, which is part of my own discipline of history, philosophy, and sociology of science. Now Alan Sokal himself is a realist, or somewhat of a critical realist about the sciences. He thinks that you really can discover at least approximate truth in the natural sciences, and so his hoax was actually in support of realism, because he was saying what low standards these postmodernist journals have for publishing this crap. Okay, now when it comes to the gender studies, I haven't actually read enough on that to know. But I think it was a similar kind of approach to say, look, if these journals are publishing, that gender is just socially constructed and all that, and trying to totally disconnect it from biological reality, that there's problems with it. So I think that was their strategy, is to try to publish something in a peer-reviewed journal make it bogus, and then by that show that they're kind of reducing to absurdity not all of what's done in gender studies, but certain aspects of gender studies. So I think that was their strategy, and I think that there is a legitimacy to that to some degree, because it's kind of like a whistleblower, but you still have to examine what arguments are in the serious essays, or at least purportedly serious, that aren't hoaxes in these journals, and take them on a case-by-case basis and evaluate them when it comes to gender studies or when it comes to postmodernist views of the natural sciences. And I think there's good reasons to think that human sexuality is not just socially constructed, although there are elements of it that are, but there are still biological realities that are involved as well. So I think, but the larger question, which these two examples were sort of pointing to, are we headed toward more trust or distrust in the sciences, whether they be the social sciences, in the case of gender studies, or the natural sciences? Well, I mean, there's a lot of talk about how, we've left modernism, we're entering into a postmodern age. But look, when you go to a modern university, you're going to find that, if you go to the engineers, they don't believe in postmodernism. They don't believe that bridges will work just because you socially construct them. If you mess up on certain physical principles, your bridge might collapse and you're toast. Your career is toast. You can't just socially construct any bridge you want. There are certain facts of the matter, and physics and physics applied in engineering is a way to get at least approximate truth. We can mess up and bridges collapse, but we can analyze those and objectively figure out how we can build better bridges. So I think that that trust in science in areas where the natural sciences have done well, particularly operation science, how nature works routinely, which involves a lot of repeatable experiments, the prestige of science is still going to remain strong, and legitimately so. That science has legitimate authority, the natural sciences. Social sciences, those are much more porous to human vices and prejudices. And so human subjectivity is able to insert itself more effectively in the social sciences than they can in the natural sciences, although the natural sciences are not immune to human subjectivity. So I would say that the natural sciences are still going to legitimately gender respect for the foreseeable future. And I think that postmodernism, very popular in English departments and in cultural studies, even there, they've tried to, like Michel Foucault's, social construction of human sexuality and imposing this into history. So a lot of this is not well founded in facts. I think even the social sciences, but anyway, I think that in general, even the social sciences are going to retain some legitimate authority, particularly as we peel away assumptions that distort the practice of the social sciences.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Okay, seems like last question for tonight. How should we respond to the skeptic who grants the influence of Christianity on science, but says that the progress is trending strongly? Christians being in a minority is very telling.
Yeah, now, the surveys show that in the case of the US, approximately half of those in the US who are professionals in the natural sciences believe in God, and the other half don't. And that hasn't really changed much. Now, when it comes to so-called elite scientific groups like the National Academy of Sciences, those tend to be much more heavily ruled by atheists and agnostics. But of course, part of that is it's a kind of an old boys network or old persons network, whatever, where you get into the club if you subscribe to the assumptions of atheism or agnosticism that the leaders do subscribe to. But when it comes to scientists in general, who teach, who apply their science in medicine and in engineering and so on, when it comes to the sciences and scientific technology, about half believe in God, the other half don't. And I think that you'll find that historically, if you rewind the tape of time to early modern science, for example, you'll find that the vast majority of practicing scientists were Christians. Of course, that number has changed, and there is a higher percentage of unbelievers who are practicing scientists today. But in the last century, that really hasn't changed a whole lot. Surveys done around the beginning of the 20th century don't differ that much from today. So some argue there's a general secularizing effect of the natural sciences, and that doesn't really follow either. Some of my colleagues in the history of science have shown that there are other factors besides the rise of the natural sciences that help explain the departure from traditional theistic religions, and science is really not to blame for that. So that helps to decouple another sort of war story between science and Christianity that's not legitimately supported by the evidence. But thanks for the question.
Thanks for that. Okay, so that wraps up our evening tonight, and I want to thank you, Dr. Keas, for your time and your great presentation and the good answers you've provided. And for all our viewers, so next week we'll be having another very interesting topic. Steve Miller will be discussing near-death experiences. So yeah, please join in for that one. It's all on our YouTube channel. Even this video of tonight will be a recording that you'll be able to watch even after the show. So thank you. Thank you to our viewers. Thank you, Dr. Keas, and have a good evening. And
yes, thanks for having me.
Of your day, Dr. Keas.
Yes, and good night to South Africa.
Thank you. All right. Bye.